Hello, my friends. Welcome to my channel. Today is the 9th of December, 2024. I was thinking about, I'm going to start a new series here. Well, it won't be very long, but I'll probably need, again, 3 videos to cover the subject. Let me tell you what I'm thinking about. I haven't read the news today or listened to anything today specifically. I have been sort of engaged in preparing this video, but of course I am up to date with what happened, up to in the world, the wars and everything up to yesterday. So I've been listening, like most of you, to what is happening with, Syria and Turkey and Russia and everything else. And I never talk about specifics about what is actually happening because I am not an analyst and there are, ample sources for us to get the news. My forte, if I have one, is to actually, what comes up to my mind immediately when I hear the news is to go to a sort of more a psychological, perhaps even a moral thing about whatever is happening gives me a sense of what came to my mind when I was reading about what was happening was betrayal. Betrayal is, could use a stronger word here. I don't know whether there are laws still in our countries in the West about treason and things. I don't know whether in the books, or perhaps they are, but they're not applied. But in any case, betrayal seems to be a sort of a more acceptable word. I have a problem with this betrayal because it seems to me one of the vilest things that a person can do, to betray your own, to betray your country, to betray your family, to betray your tribe, that your group, and kind of sell your soul to the devil, as it were. We hear, in many cases, for example, in Germany in the 30s, how what they call the kapos, those were Jewish people who were actually informing the Germans about where the Jewish people were or who they were and so on. That kind of betrayal to your own, I consider it one of the vilest things that a human being can do, really. Vile, So I thought, okay, I'm not going to talk about the specifics of war because as I said, I'm not an analyst and I don't know. But what comes to my mind is that sense of, in this particular case, betrayal. Okay, so I thought, okay, let me perhaps talk about that, collect my thoughts a little bit about it and see what I can say. And I find that I have spoken about this in other videos, and I thought perhaps I will be too repetitive about saying the same thing. So I thought about this. I thought that I will talk about these issues that I consider so important by going back to history and explaining them through examples of what has already happened in history. The reason for this is that if we talk about what is happening at the moment, it's so close to us that we might not see it in the whole perspective, in the whole breadth. If I was to say about this thing about Turkey, this thing about Syria, whatever, it's so close that you will think, well, no, because you're taking this side, you don't. But when we separate ourselves and look at things very similar that happened in history, because of that distance, we don't get so emotionally excited about it that we lose our reasoning powers. So we can look at it a little bit more calmly and see what happened there. So I'm going to start with, I find that this betrayal is all around us. We don't need to go to what is happening in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe, in our own countries too. And I find that betrayal by politicians, our own politicians, betrayal by the church, for example, the Catholic Church, certainly, I feel very strongly that it has betrayed Catholics. You might, my goodness, what are you saying? I'm saying that many of us are aware of that infiltration that has taken place in the Catholic Church, in the Vatican. But that infiltration was started a long time ago, and it became apparent really during the 20th century. And it became obvious and visible in the 1960s. But we can no longer talk of infiltration, my friends. Infiltration is over. What is happening now is that the Catholic Church has been taken over. It's no longer a process of infiltration. The Vatican is not representing the Catholic Church. It has been taken over. So I thought about betrayal. I was going to start by the very first thing of the church and what happened to Christianity and Christian values and Christendom and all that. Okay, by first of all talking about this betrayal by the church, and in other forthcoming videos I will talk about other kinds of betrayal, but I want to start with what I consider first and foremost, and that is religion in the West. And I'm going to use the example of a country that, as you know, I know fairly well, and that is the country of Spain, which is the country of my birth. Now, please don't go away, because I am fully aware that Spain is not a country that particularly interests you in any way, and why should it? And I'm going to talk about something that happened 80 years ago in order to get this distance. But I'm going to use it as an example, as an extreme example of what happened to this country that had that Catholic faith from the very first century, through thick and thin and through all the invasions and through everything else that happened in these 2,000 years of Christianity. This was a country that, for reasons, historical invasions, all the rest of it, retained that faith. You don't need to agree with that faith. You know, I'm going to get already comments by saying, well, that happens to you because you worship the Pope. That is not the point. The point is that for a nation that held one particular one religion throughout its history, and how that religion betrayed that country at the end, because it was the Catholic Church that betrayed Spain. That's quite a big thing to say. I am going to give you examples by following on several talks I have been listening to, conferences given now, a few months ago, about the history of the 20th century in Spain, you know that there was a civil war and so on and so forth. Okay, so most of you speaking in English, so in English-speaking countries, you know that what happened was that there was a civil war, and on one side there was General Franco, fascist, bad, and on the other side were the Republican forces, freedom and democracy and good. And can I ask you to please be a little bit patient with me and give me a little bit of the benefit of the doubt when I tell you that that wasn't exactly like that. Can you at least admit this? Accept this, okay? That things were very, very complicated, much more so, okay? And there is good and bad in both camps, and how the whole thing developed that ended up in a horrendous civil war. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to just, this is just, for you to say, bear with me, because I am trying to explain a very difficult situation and how it ended up, and how it ended up by the Catholic Church herself betraying the nation whose DNA, whose psychology in your country is different. But in that particular country, a country that for the whole of her history, its aim was always to defend that faith. Agree or disagree, but that was the DNA, the psychic of that nation. Look, in this is what I mean. In different countries with different histories, okay? In a recent, not so recent interview, perhaps a few months ago, Tucker Carlson was interviewing Hungary's Prime Minister Orban. Yeah, and he was trying to explain to him that the West is reading Russia wrong. This was a few months ago, okay? And Tucker Carlson asked him, well, what do you mean, And he said, well, look, in the West, when we think about our political systems and our governments and so on, the first thing we think of is freedom. Yeah, okay, freedom, okay. He said, that is not the case in Russia. In Russia, the main thing there in people's mind, the main concern is the defense of the motherland, defense of Mother Russia. That is the priority, the thing that they have, sort of in their soul. That's number one. Obviously, because of history, invasions, this and that. So that is the main thing. And if you have to starve, you starve. And if you have to do this, you do this. And if you have to do that, you do that. But that is the main thing. And freedom will be second or third or 24th. Okay, but it's not the guiding force of what makes the people tick, as it were. The same. What I'm trying to say here is that in Spain it was the defense of that religion, of that faith. Again, because of historical reasons, invasions from every, first century, all the martyrs. But it was horrific already. Then I have to hear, Swedes who got Christianity in the 11th century saying, oh, they don't know what Catholics don't know what Christianity means. And you have to put up with things like this. But a country that fought, obviously, not obviously, but certainly for 800 years against Arabs and Muslims, to defend their faith. Well, that gives you a sort of a psychological, do you understand, thing that I think it was Dr. Marshall who said that that Spanish Catholicism seems to be always different, because it always seems to be, rather militaristic. Well, it has its reasons. It is in the psychic of the nation. My point in all this is not to give you an example of my point is that for which you spent your whole life, if you were an individual, protecting, that thing betrayed you at the end. How do you come out of that? And I use it as an example only because it is not only that particular country that was betrayed. We can say that, again, as I said, I'll talk about other things, but today I'm going to insist on this Catholic bit, okay, of the church. What is happening today, but I'm not going to talk about what is happening today. You have many other channels that do that, or perhaps you're so fed up that you don't want to hear about it, or perhaps, as is in my case, it's just too painful sometimes to continuously hear about what is happening, and you just have, for your own psychological health, have to just put it aside a little bit. You can't deal with it anymore. You can't digest it anymore. You need a break from all that. Okay, so it's going to be up to you to join the dots, as it were, okay, as to what is happening today. I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about an example of what happened to this particular country and how it came about. Okay, so it is, as a traditional Catholic, that's what I am, can't help it. What am I to do? Where am I to go? That's what I am. And that's who I am. And also, as a person who was born in Spain and lived in Spain through my very early years, my formative years, that this is all rather painful. So I don't do it out of glee or out of accusing, oh, look, what it doesn't bring me any joy to do it. It brings me, pain, really. That's what it does, But let's see if I can do this. The other thing is that what we have to take into account here is that, the well-known phrase that truth will set you free. And so when you have to say some truths, it leaves a bitter taste in your mouth to speak out, but one cannot remain silent. Okay. And when I'm going to say the church, this is just for simplification, to summarize. I'm not talking about every single individual Catholic, every single individual priest or bishop. I'm just talking about the church, the hierarchy, really, in its, more general form. To the hierarchy, to many in the clergy, priests, because in this particular case of Spain, it was the authorities, the ones who had the authority, the responsibility, and the obligation to defend the faith, the ones that betrayed it. That does not exempt us, the individual faithful, from our faults. We all have our faults and what we do and fail to do, but I'm going to talk about the hierarchy, the way they led or misled the people. So having said this, I'll start with a categorical statement. In my opinion, in this particular case of this country, there have been many theories about who betrayed whom. Was it the king? Was it the armed forces? Was it the independent secessionists and independents and so on? Well, no. The ones who betrayed the church, the ones who betrayed the state, first and foremost, was the church. The church was the pillar, it was the key, and it was the cornerstone of Spain's betrayal, of the betrayal of Spain, should I say. In the 60s and 70s, when General Franco died and there was a change coming, that was called the transition to democracy, fine. But there was never, and this is my point, there was never a transition to anything. What there was a monumental betrayal by everyone. Betrayal of whom? First of all, betrayal of, let me start with general statements. It's up to you to bring it up to date if you wish to. Okay, I'm using this example of this country at that particular time as an example. All right. First, betrayal of God. First, betrayal of Spain. Betrayal to that man that was General Franco, whom you know already he was so bad, but I will have to talk about this in later videos. Betrayal of those who fell in the war, that most people call the Civil War, others call it the Last Crusade, others call it the War of Liberation, whatever you might call it. Betrayal of the martyrs that fell there. And there were many, many martyrs. It was the worst persecution, church persecution, suffered by the Catholic Church in Spain since the Napoleonic invasion. And also at the end, a betrayal of all those that during the peace years contributed with their toil and their suffering, our parents and grandparents, to lift Spain from the mire into which it had fallen. The church was the key and the cornerstone of that betrayal, and I'm going to prove it to you. It sounds cliché, but in the case of this particular country, Spain, if it is not Catholic, it is not Spain. And we are seeing it again today, unfortunately. The greatest glories, the birth of the country, all because of that faith. This is unquestionable, and many historians have written, if it had not been for the Catholic Church and what Spaniards did throughout 2,000 years, the history of Spain could be summarized in 2 paragraphs. I'm trying to draw your attention to this union of that country with that religion. And so this is unquestionable. The best moments were in that history when Spaniards were with her, with that faith. The worst, the periods of decadence when the country turned its back on that church. So this is Spain. This seems to be its destiny. It is true that Spain is different in this regard. Spain is different was one of those slogans used in the 60s to attract people, vacationers and people to go and visit Spain, tourists and so on. But it is true. It's a difference that Spain always had in Europe vis-a-vis other nations. You only have to look at the history to prove it. But after several centuries of decadence, mainly due to it could have started actually with the forced Bourbon monarchy inflicted on it, and certainly to that 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century, that would end up in this most horrible of wars. But I think that this war was, it sounds terrible to say it, but it was, at the end, it was necessary. Every other possible way was exhausted, and it was obvious that it could only end up in this way. When you have exhausted all possible other ways, when there is corruption at the top of the government, when they no longer listen to anybody, when it is this is my way or the highway or whatever, inevitably it's you have no way out. It's going to end in a war. It might have taken this way or that way, but that it would end up in a war, it was obvious that that is how it would end up. If only to get it out of that mire, horrendous as it was. Now, let me see. Okay, so what we have then is two sides. One that is going to try to change the country from within. One that is going to try to do away with that religion. That which is going to, you could put it in this way, bring the French Revolution to that country, Spain, in the 1930s. What I mean by this is that those that try to, that side that tried to invert and change the country completely, and those who wanted to preserve that for which they had fought throughout their whole existence. I know that this may sound extreme. If I say to you that one side was fighting, the nationalist side was fighting for their religion, for God, for Spain, all that it may sound a little bit extreme. Depending on what country you come from, if that sounds very extreme and difficult to understand, think of your country, put religion out of it, and think of your own country and the culture of your country. Your country has this culture, and suddenly you see it being threatened, overwhelmed by whatever forces, okay? And one side that wants to change that culture, put religion out of it for a minute, and the other that says, no, this is who we are. This is our culture, and we want to preserve our culture. This is who we are. Okay, so it might become more easy to understand in that sense. In the case of Spain, who never experienced any other religion, that was the culture. That is what was the nationalist side was trying to defend. Okay. And they saw it in these terms, and I know it sounds extreme in these days, but they saw it as to prevent that God and his church be erased from our land, our country, and to prevent Spain and what it was to disappear and become sort of whatever it was to become, an imitator of others. So the problem there, the conflict, was very real and very raw. The cost, oh my goodness. Yes, there was a cost. Rivers of blood, sweat and tears, and misery and hunger, as all wars really are. That is probably why it is better to try not to get to that point where war is inevitable. Because at the end of a war, everyone loses. Even the winners lose. And of course, many, many lives. But they saw that the victory was essential, and that the victory was eventually was a gift. Why a gift? Because so much life sacrificed, voluntarily and generously. But you know, miracles do happen, but miracles, to my understanding, my deficient understanding, for I am no theologian, is that miracles are never gratis, free of charge. They could, if God wishes, he will do that, but normally he wants you to make a little bit of an effort too. They certainly need faith, but also will. And then God may or may not assent to them. If I can give you an example of how St. John of the Cross, with his inimitable, inimitable, I was going to say inevitable, inimitable way of explaining things, always with figures and examples and parables, so that we can understand it better. He tells us that, look, because of our fallen nature, in other words, that we know we have the possibility, the choice of choosing the right way towards God or against God, he says, it's not necessarily even that he's trying to make you do something so amazing. No, he says, look, you are at a crossroads. This is his example. You are at a crossroads. You can go this way or that way. All he asks of you is that you at least try a little bit, to lift your foot and try to go in his direction. He doesn't even need you to run miles. The path away from God is always very pleasing and very comfortable. It looks very, very sweet. And the path towards God always looks very, very hard and very difficult for us. And so, even if only, he explains, even if only you were just to lift your foot and try, just try to say, well, perhaps I will go in this right direction. God will run, miles to greet you there, just for that little bit of a try to lift your foot, because he knows how difficult it is. So we have to do a little bit, at least try a little bit to do something on our part. Yeah. After that conflict, what happened? Well, what we had was finally unity and peace and justice, because I know that all you heard was revenge and repression and all the rest of it. There was justice, which is different. And to a large extent, actually, quite a little bit of prosperity there. The country was in ruins, and because the country remained neutral, and because of other aspects also, but during the Second World War, Spain was not a beneficiary of the Marshall Plan that helped Europe to rebuild itself. So it took a while and a lot of hunger and a lot of misery. But eventually in the 60s, in the 50s, really began to breathe again economically, a little bit. But the most important gift, actually, was a profound re-Christianization of Spain. Since half of Spain had been already by that time completely lost under the usual Masonic influence. No, you cannot deny that. It's there. So what happened? Well, Spain, in this using, as I said many times as an example, it became Catholic again. And in the particular case of this country, it may not be in yours, but in the particular case of this country, for Spain to become Catholic again, it meant that it became Spain again. It recovered its being, it recovered its conscious, its reference. That was the great benefit. The main pillar, the unity of church and state, was then forged. A unity. Oh my goodness, I hear you cry. How can you defend union of church and state? Because it just seems so natural now in the West that there has to be a separation of church and state. I understand that. But let me explain what church and state, that union meant and had in Spain and had meant in Europe. it is very important that this is understood. Because of this, many times you could have heard, in order to equate what was going on in other parts of Europe, that it was called national Catholicism. Yeah, national, many other things, yeah. But it was not that. There was no national Catholicism. It was never that. But as I said, let me explain about this union of church and state, or state and church. Precisely how the church had always defended it. 3 characteristics here. The first is very important. It comes directly from the Council of Chalcedon, defined in the year 541. The time when the church begins to spread. How does that council define this union? It defines it like this. It is a union without confusion. Whoops, something is coming up, I'm sorry. A union without confusion. Confusion in the Latin meaning mixture. In other words, union without being all mixed up in a sort of, where you don't know the difference between one and the other. So a union without confusion, mixing up, and a division without separation. A union without mixing it up, mixing both together so that you don't know the difference, and a division, separate, without separation, that one goes in this way and the other goes in that way. That is how they defined it. That was the union between church and state that that side wanted to, always kept and wanted to keep and encourage. And this characteristic must be remembered when it comes to explain this to third parties that they don't understand when they're challenging it. Another characteristic of that union, that the nation, this is Catholic doctrine regarding church and state, that the nation owes to God, as each one of us owes to God individually, but the nation also owes to God worship, love, and obedience. In other words, that nations also owe obedience to God. Another characteristic, that religious unity, that union in the Catholic religion, other religions can do other things and understand it differently. But in Catholic understanding, that unity is fundamental because of that unity, you are also going to get social unity, the unity of the homeland, the unity of the nation. Without religious unity, you will not have any of that. We are seeing it in the world today. Another characteristic is that the state, that meaning the government, the political, administrative state, has the obligation to help and defend the church in the event of any attack that it may receive. Again, in other countries, think of it in terms of culture. Your culture is being attacked, or your constitution is being attacked. You have, as a government, the obligation and the responsibility to defend it. This does not mean that other dissident beliefs, let's call them that, cannot be consented to when they are well rooted within the larger community, or they are protected by treaties and agreements in order not to persecute others. Yeah. So what we have in this country in the 40s and 50s is this unity again. And in those years, the state could count with the loyalty of the church. In those years, in those 2 decades, the Franco regime had favored the church like it had never been favored before. It assigned to the church, I tell you this because I'm going to talk about the betrayal, okay? So this is what was happening. It assigned, for example, a budget to the church to compensate for everything that had been stolen from her by the Republican forces. The Republican forces against the church had been a total devastation. Okay, I will have the opportunity to tell you in another video how they went for especially priests in the cruelest of manners. It wasn't just that they would kill priests, which they did. They would just go and kill the priest, shot them on the head or whatever. But it was the torture that they used in so very many cases. What do I mean, torture? Well, cutting off their genitals and putting them in their mouth. For example. Or getting a nun and draining her blood and then selling it as nun sausage. That is the situation that was going on before General Franco moved to put a stop to it. I'm telling you, I'm going to tell you about these things. Anyway. So he defended the church, assigned a budget to compensate for everything that had been stolen from her in terms of things. It trusted her directly and indirectly with all the education, university education, secondary education, primary education, labor and trade training colleges. It gave her key in hand. The charge of the not only centers of education, seminaries, training centers. It gave her opened up to her a whole lot of media outlets that had never had before. Not in that manner. And all, of course, free of charge. It placed on the church all its trust and gave her immense power. More still, the laws that were passed, all laws, were always based on the social and moral doctrine of the Catholic Church. Hence, quite a lot of success for people, coexistence of people, and success for the church itself too. So what happened next? Very simple. The 60s came. So that was the situation in the 40s and 50s in that country. Then came the 60s. And something changed. Not the regime. What was going to change was the church herself. What changed in the 60s and from then on in an unbridled way was the change in the church itself. We know about the infiltration, from the 19th century. And now, in the 60s, this is where the betrayal is going to start. It has been said in many conferences that the betrayal started with other things. No. The betrayal to the Spain of the 40s and 50s came from the church itself. And everyone is actually going to follow the church's lead because its power was immense, spiritually, especially spiritual power, which is the one that drags, let me put it that way, for better or for worse, everything else. The armed forces, the police. And if that spiritual sustenance is missing, as we are going to see it was, everything else follows and everything else fails. Just to give it a name, I'm going to call all this anti-Catholic influence, I'm going to call it the evil one or the malign one. But you all know that what that means. The same force that brought about the French Revolution and every other anti-church, anti-Christian stand in Europe. But let's call it the evil one, so we know he exists. And we recognize him straight away as a great professional of chaos creation. That's what he does wherever he goes. He goes, they go. In that decade, he realizes in the 60s that he no longer needs to go around killing priests. It's actually counterproductive. They become martyrs and people may follow them. No, that's counterproductive. You don't do that anymore. But he, this malign one, knows that if he influences, if he gains, attracts the shepherds, the flock will follow behind or will scatter, which is just about the same. So what does the evil one do? He's going to take advantage of that situation, of a situation that we must see, we must recognize clearly in those days and what is going on today. What was it? Okay, so let me put the context here. It had been infiltrated, we know that, but after World War II, the church found herself in a tremendous situation that I think actually caught her a little bit unprepared or off guard. Very simply, she finds herself in a world divided in two and facing each other with practically blood and fire. I mean, just, really facing each other to this point. It's you and it's me here. Okay, On the one hand, we have the Marxist bloc, the communist bloc. That is also, its influence is also going to expand to Latin America, the multiple revolutions there. If you remember, if you were not alive, obviously you don't remember, but in those days, the communist parties in Europe were flourishing, very, very powerful. The Communist Party in the West, remember France, remember Italy. The Allies had gifted the Soviet Union with half of Europe, or Stalin. The Cold War was at its peak. This is what was happening in the world, decolonization everywhere, coming through in many cases, the UN sort of Freemasonry resolutions. All of a sudden, nations were sprouting up like mushrooms in any wise, in Africa, in Asia. Nations that had been drawn, it seemed, on a piece of paper in London or Paris, straight lines, countries in Africa, or, without any references to the history or the tribe or the culture or the religion or the language of those particular countries. And then we also find, with this, in the midst of all this hustle and bustle, the state of Israel there, it's put there, okay. All these, so many movements, everything is changing so rapidly, I think actually finds the church totally off guard. And so, taking advantage of this situation, the malign one goes directly for her throat, against the pastors themselves, against the shepherds themselves. With what tools? Well, some new ones, some old tricks, One. Modernism. That's what the church calls it, modernism. In political terms, we call it liberalism. But from the days of Pius X, and perhaps even earlier, the church calls it modernism. And Pius X had already defined modernism or liberalism as the heresy of all heresies, because it encompasses them all. We have the spread of socialism and communism, and with that something called liberation theology that was going to permeate throughout Latin America and Spain too. And we have, of course, relativism coming perhaps for the first time to Catholic countries. He had come to other countries in Europe through the Reformation, yes, but in many countries it was new. Relativism. We find savage capitalism, liberalism, all this, okay. And what happens is, at this moment, that the church, instead of clinging to God, to His word that will never pass and will never change, to her doctrine that she had kept for 2,000 years, at this precise moment, abandons that and allows herself to be tempted. Remember that being tempted is not a sin. It is succumbing to that temptation that is a sin, something that perhaps Luther got not quite right, because Luther he had problems with controlling his concupiscence, let us say. Okay, and he felt that being tempted was already a sin. No. It's succumbing to that temptation. And we already know that the best tool to avoid falling into that incipient temptation is to, first of all, brave it up. Know what is happening, and then run. Run from it. Run from temptation, because if you stay there for a little bit too long, you will fall. For sure, you will fall. Because temptation is this very attractive maiden pulling you towards her, for you gents. Very attractive lady. For us ladies, I don't think it's the same. It's, I don't know what is these beautiful sweet nothings in our ear. Oh, you stay there for a little bit too long, you lost it. So brave it up first and then run. All right. But the church fell and is falling into the temptation of the world. Remember those things we learned as children? What was it? The great temptations, the world, the devil, and the flesh, something like that. Anyway, what does she do? The church. Simple. She preferred to adapt herself to the world instead of adapting the world to her, which is more difficult, obviously. Yes, it was infiltrated, okay. The infiltration had occurred. What had occurred in the past is that the pagan, what she had done in the past was that she Christianized the pagan world. And now she was giving that up and was allowing us now to go back really to that pagan world. And so the church enters into a dialogue with the world instead of preaching the gospel to the world. The church opted to get along well with the world, rather than that was easier than to have to suffer and put up with the contempt that the world felt for her. In short, she modernized herself. She became worldly. Everyone remember what they called it, the aggiornamento, or, modernization. Aggiornamento. Yes, we all started, the church started to aggiornamize herself. My miniskirt long enough or short enough? And so the church loses the battle. It ends up giving in and giving up rather than fight. It is a crisis of faith. It no longer trusts herself because it begins not to trust in God. It loses her faith, which is the root of that tree by which everything else, including us, is sustained. And so we have a Pope, John the 23rd. He calls for a council. You know which one. There are 2,000 cardinals in that council. In the Council of Trent, there were 300. In Vatican I, there were 800. Here we have 2,000. That is practically uncontrollable. 2,000 people in one room, however big the room may be. I say uncontrollable, perhaps controlling them was not what they were thinking of in any case. And proceeds, and this is the last straw, to invite heretics and pagans and other religions, and lets them sit there and see and hear and talk back in the back room. These people already helped by many of the cardinals there present. Cardinals who had, let me put it this way, already been infected by Freemasonry. That is the main problem of Vatican II. But there are two more problems. John the 23rd at that moment sends an envoy to an ambassador to Paris who meets with another envoy from Moscow. Because, remember, this is the early 60s and the rise of communism scares John the 23rd. He actually believes that he might be unstoppable. In some way, therefore, we have to kind of get along with it, because it might end up actually dominating all, and so he thinks that it will be better to pact. Pact what? He pacts that Vatican II is not going to renew the condemnation that the Church had always had against communism. It's a pact with the devil. And pacts with the devil of any kind can benefit you for a moment, but evidently there are pacts with the devil. Many pacts with the devil, but you will see that at the end, the one who loses out in the end is you. He's smarter than you are. He's smarter than all of us. It is never for you and your benefit, your pact with the devil. Further still, 400 cardinals at that time in that council sent him, the Pope, a letter saying that they want communism to be condemned again. And what does John the 23rd do? He, practically throws the letter into a drawer, and he didn't even put it to a vote. At least he could have put it to a vote and present the cardinals with this, the rest of the cardinals, and let them decide. No, not even that, not even the opportunity to do that. Another important factor, let's see, the official texts of that Vatican II, all of them. If you read them, I haven't read them all, but you get the impression that there is nothing specific that you can say, oh, this is really bad. Not bad in themselves. The problem was that so many things were inserted. We know now because we know of the active Masonic infiltration, but the problem is that there are so many that are full of these, how would you call them, calculated ambiguities are inserted there, with a view, we know now, towards the subsequent practice of what was going to happen for the post-council, for which the cardinals, the hierarchy, an already infected hierarchy, that will later allow them to do what they did in the post-council. They were vague enough, that calculated ambiguity, that they could say, yes, this is allowed. Simple example that you all already know, the quote is, I think if the quote is, for example, the official language of the church continues to be Latin. In parentheses, well, in some cases, with the permission of the bishop, the vernacular language might be used. Yeah? We know that they never said Latin is prohibited. This is just the most obvious, simple example. But this is an example that shows you, okay? The official language of the church continues to be Latin, though in some cases, with the permission of the bishop, the vernacular might be used. And so then everyone gave their permission. The cowards. And now we have what we have, whatever that is. Before, you could have gone to Japan, or you could go to Timbuktu, or you could go to Sweden or Ohio or the Scottish Highlands. It was always exactly the same. And just as when people begin to travel, they changed. So what happens? Well, that's where it starts. The year 65, when it closes, when the Vatican II closes, that's where the betrayal to tradition starts. And what is happening in Spain, in this country at that time? Spain at the time was an island, let's put it that way, in the midst of this kind of storm of what was going on. And it is an island because of that Franco regime. And that union going back to Chalcedon of church and state during the 40s and the 60s. So in 65, in the year 1965, that treason begins. Why? Because the power of the church there in Spain is immense. Her influential capacity was tremendous. When used for good, in the 40s and 50s, everything flourished. From the 60s onwards, is going to use that influence clearly for ill. Because it is the church itself already that it is in the midst of a crisis. Paul VI, 1968. Paul VI has one thing in his mind. He disliked Spain tremendously, Paul VI. There have been many popes who have disliked Spain tremendously. Paul VI is certainly one of them. And he has in mind really the ultimate destruction of the Spanish regime. The destruction, therefore, of Spain. The destruction of that union. And with that, the spiritual destruction of Spain. What tools is he going to use, Paul VI? First, out of his sleeve somewhere, he pulls out this thing about auxiliary bishops. Auxiliary bishops. They didn't exist before. What is this thing? What is this new thing about auxiliary bishops? Do you know where I'm going? You had a bishop in the diocese, and okay, he was the head of that diocese. Okay. Why? Because with this measure, he's going to skip an obligation that the Pope had to submit the names of potential bishops in Spain to the head of state. This is a right granted to the Catholic monarchs when they named them officially Catholic monarchs, Queen Isabella and Queen Ferdinand. This was a right that they had, not to go around saying, okay, let me see, lots of priests here, you're a bishop. It wasn't like that. What was the procedure that it had always been used like that? Okay, this is from the 1400s, okay? It's called the right of presentation. The procedure was that the Vatican would choose 6 names for a bishop, okay, went to nominate a bishop, 6 names, and then those 6 names would be given to the Spanish nuncio, that is the equivalent of the ambassador, yeah? And the nuncio in Spain would then give it to the head of the state, those 6 names chosen by the Vatican. And out of those 6 names, the head of state would choose 3. And those 3 would be given back to the nuncio, and then they would be given back to the Vatican. And then the Vatican, out of those 3, would choose 1. That was the right of presentation that the Spanish heads of states had always had from the 1400s. And Paul VI knew that he had to do that, and so he, out of his sleeve from somewhere, got these auxiliary bishops now. You can see by what I told you that really it was the Vatican that chose ultimately the bishop. Well, these auxiliary bishops that he proceeded to choose, all of them already infected, puts them into dioceses, and being the auxiliary, obviously, soon enough would become the titulars, the bishop themselves, who would then dedicate themselves and devote themselves to what you can imagine they did afterwards. Another tool, very important, that I would invite you to remember always, the Church violating her own doctrine, Paul VI is going to demand and impose on the Franco regime 3 things that are going to just blow it up, basically. Because there were 3 things that supported him. 1, the Church itself is going to impose on him the actual separation of church and state. I have talked about that. You know what that meant in a Catholic country. Now they have to be separated, just like in Protestant countries, yeah? In the United States, for example. That's number 1. Also, that was a major change. Also, the church is official. The church herself is going to officially demand religious freedom. Misunderstood about persecuting Protestants. Pray tell me how many Protestants were in Spain. I mean, Protestantism never got to Spain. The problem with Spain is that it came, as I have said many times, through secularism, through France, through Freemasonry. Okay? Protestantism never really got to Spain. So how many Protestants did you have? There were 3 or 4 somewhere, vacationing in the Costa del Sol, perhaps. Persecuting Protestants. Where? Okay. And one more thing. It has to become an not confessional, a confessional state, which is really the conclusion of the other two. That is to say, a confessional, what a nice word. What it means is a secular state. Let's call a spade spade, a secular state. So the church is imposing on Spain a secular state. Fine, okay. So separating church and state, doing away with that union without confusion, division without separation from the Chalcedon 451 Council. And that brought about another consequence. One of the works of the malign that in time ended up placing the state and the church in opposing places, confronting each other. With the second, the religious freedom thing, I know it sounds very good. Religious freedom. These things always sound very good. But in the case of this particular country, whose religion was its culture, again, in your own country, very different. Put away religion and think of this as your culture. What happens is that if you are forced to consider that other cultures are the same as your own, what you end up losing is your own. In other words, what you end up losing is the prevalence of that culture, and in the case of Spain, the prevalence of that religion. And so you take away the reference, cultural, religious reference of those people, who now with this culture and that culture and the other culture don't know where they are. Well, in the case of Spain, because of its unique history, you take away that religion. This religion is the same as that one, that then you take away the terms of reference of the people. And if you take away the terms of reference when you're talking about morals, you take away practically their conscience, because they don't even know. They don't have that reference. And let's look at our leaders today. Many with no conscience, really. Many totally immoral. Everything is allowed from their point of view, no restraints. No reference. And what comes next, since what comes next necessarily is that you end up with a secular state, and in Catholic countries, when you end up with a secular state, what happens is that you end up persecuting the church. That is how it always ends up. So now, today, in this country, they have returned to the 30s. So, the three together, without the state support of the church, without that help, without that defense, what happens? Well, logical. It divides, it becomes worldly, it becomes dependent, subjected to the state. Lest they make us pay taxes or something. Yeah. What happens? It loses the faith, stops preaching the gospel, or preaches only one part of it because the other part may be a little bit too harsh, may go against this and against that. He may even offend someone. and the flock scatter, and they withdraw into their own private realm. And so the church becomes insipid. No salt left. And the malign one has triumphed. When during that whole transition period, after Franco died and all that, when they're working on the Constitution, and they're dealing with whether or not to make the Communist Party legal and so on, the leader of the Communist Party, Santiago Carrillo, I met him actually, leader of in the 70s, you will remember Euro communism and all that. He said something. He was not stupid. He actually was a criminal murderer, but he was not stupid. He said that the regime would be defeated by means of both the cross and the sword. Poetic language. Was going to attack it by means of the cross. Using the cross against the self. We're talking about, obviously, infiltrating the church, demolishing the church from within, demolishing the fundamental pillar on which the regime was based. And Marxism will enter the church here in a brutal way. There would be labor unions, workers' commissions, all born in parishes, not out of the conferences and things. No, they start in the church, in the parish. And there is a cardinal, I'll give you the name, a bishop, Arguello, who would attend this fervently. And there are photos of him with the leader of the Communist Party. We have the photos with an angelic face there. Oh my goodness, admiring him. Well, perhaps angelic is not the right word. An enlightened communist. What they have achieved. Okay. What they achieved is that the church turned against the regime in the decade of the 60s. What happens to the church herself? Okay, so they went against the regime who had supported them, but okay, fine. What happens to the church herself? Well, you see, when you sell your soul to the devil, he will always win in the end. And the cassock was changed for the priestly collar, and then the collar was changed for a sweater and a jacket, and then the sweater and the jacket changed for, I don't know what, a dress, perhaps. What the consequence? The secularization of priests. This was tremendous. This was a tremendous change. And churches becoming kind of like old warehouses. No images, no sculpture, no painting, no nothing. And in many times the tabernacle being put out there, sort of in a place where, out of sight. And in those places, in those churches, now they're being used for concerts. Concerts perhaps of what? Perhaps even Gregorian chants, but as a concert. not as part of an official religious service, liturgy. And that's not the worst of it. How about dance rooms or yoga classes or theater plays or whatever it is that they do there in some churches nowadays? Hare Krishna, perhaps? So, the religious orders begin to die out. In some cases, they even pull the trigger themselves. Nobody's left. The monastic life, nuns, well, now you can open the door and, leave gossip magazines, glamour. The Gregorian chant, sublime, that has been left for recording companies. This was part of the Mass and the liturgy, the office of the hours anyway. And what do we have now? We have these foul-sounding guitars and these sort of almost inhuman squawks because they cannot even sing. It's a song that they sing about a boat or something. We are in a boat, here comes the boat. There is no one in the boat, everyone is outside the boat. We are at the end, we don't even know what happened to the damn boat. That's the list of it. And also many secular movements that have flourished during the regime, Catholic associations, young people and so on, they're all gone. And you may ask yourself, if you're still with me, so what was the hierarchy doing in the meantime? Well, there are many photos. I mean, this isn't, this is just from the 70s, so not that long ago. Photos of, this Monsignor, I'll give you the name. He was very famous at the time. I believe he's passed, yeah. But anyway, Monsignor Tarancon, laughing out loud there, with Carrillo, the leader of the Communist Party, with the first Prime Minister. I won't go into all that, but nevertheless, there they are laughing their heads off. And this is, if you want to look at a picture, the proof that the church was comfortable, the church had sold out. Not only that, then it's going to have separatist priests. This is truly amazing. I'm just trying to tell you the changes that occurred, because the Basque Country was actually always had been the most Catholic, that part of northern Spain, the most Catholic of all. That is where all the missionaries went. That is when St. Francis Xavier and Ignatius of Loyola, and it was really the Carlists, lots of history there, but it was if you wanted within Catholic Spain, what was the more Catholic part? The Basque Country would be one of them. All of a sudden, all the priests were separatists. They apostatized from the true faith and embraced a belief of separatism, secessionism, not nationalism really, because they were never individual separate nations, but let's say regionalism. Another religion. Another work from the devil. Why from the devil? Because he poisons the understanding, rots the soul, and leads to those who fall into his clutches, leads them to murder and cold and cruel and merciless behavior, even against children. And this phenomenon is practically insane, diabolical in the Basque Country, in Catalonia, but will spread. The madness goes so far. And we know this, for example, you might have heard of the terrorist band, the ETA, separatists, yes. We know now hand in hand with the CIA, by the way, but we didn't know that at the time. But in any case, we know that it was born in the parishes of the church. It took refuge in the sacristies. It was protected by bishops, many priests, religious, and many of the perhaps even altar boys became bloodthirsty criminals, killing indiscriminately. But there is more, worse. Soon the church is going to deny the victims of terrorism, victims who died, the victims of the assassins, when their relatives wanted the priest to say a mass for them, for their souls, they would deny them that. They would deny the relatives of the victims, innocent victims, the purification of saying the Mass for their souls. Everyone knows that. In the Basque Country, priests were not allowed or would not say a Mass for the victims of terrorism. And in Madrid itself, this Monsignor Tarancon, the one with the photograph laughing his head off, banned one Mass for a victim. This was a rather important person, so there was going to be, sort of a big Mass. I'm sorry, I'm being, but his relatives wanted a Mass said for his own soul. And since the people insisted that they wanted a Mass celebrated, he actually called the police, who sent everyone home, beating the hell out of all of them. The church submissively dissolved everyone, prohibiting, as I said, the benefit of saying a Mass for their souls. You cannot get to be more vile than this in your treason. The church in Spain, ladies and gentlemen, was the driving force behind the betrayal of everyone else, against God, against Spain, against Franco, against the regime, against those who had fallen. If you didn't agree with the regime, that's fine, but against those who have fallen in that last fight, and against the martyrs. Was there anybody who resisted? Well, yes, there was a priestly brotherhood, actually, of so-called brotherhood of priests or something like that. It was a group of up to 6,000 priests, just normal priests, yeah, who tried everything possible in any case. so that, to try to change things. But the hierarchy, mostly by now all lost and infected, impose the old chestnut, oh, obedience, obedience, obedience to us, obedience to the Pope, of how so many times the Church has manipulated the faithful. And there were some in the hierarchy too that fought against it. Forgive me for saying their names, but I think someone has to say them somewhere, even in this little room of mine. Monsignor Marcelo González, from the Diocese of Toledo, he fought against it. Monsignor Guerra Campos, everybody knows them in Spain. He is perhaps the best known, from Cuenca, a beautiful city, by the way, old city. They did what they could, perhaps. Small critique, but a very, very small one. Perhaps they lacked taking that extra step that Monsignor Archbishop Lefebvre took. They didn't go as far as that, but that's minor. Who am I to say? And to the point the hierarchy had got, to what extent they had got, that one of these, Monsignor Campos, said at one time that he had given up going to the Episcopal assemblies, the Episcopal conferences. He said it was a weapon of distraction of priests and the faithful. He said that he had stopped going to them because if he did, he was somewhat afraid that what he heard there would eventually make him lose his faith. This is in an Episcopal conference, ladies and gentlemen. So he stayed in his little Roman town of Cuenca, and there he was. Further still, nauseating landmark. A joint assembly of bishops and priests is called. This is a scandal. This is in 1971. Just to show you the level of degradation that they had already reached, both priests and bishops, that in that assembly it is put to a vote that the Church asks forgiveness or apologizes for what he had done during the war. A war that the Church itself had called the Last Crusade, for all intents and purposes. They wanted to turn that around. And the vote was 123 against, 113 in favor, and 10 abstained, practically a technical tie. There was no overwhelming majority, but, not even an understanding of what had happened. But still, further with that assembly, they reached in the minutes a conclusion, the official document, okay, and the official document with the abstract, the conclusion, I think they call it, the most important part of it, was of such caliber that there was actually, in bad terms, I mean, that actually someone sent a copy. It caught his attention, and actually, perhaps it was some pang of conscience or something, and actually reported this to the Vatican, sent it to the Vatican. And the Vatican, remember at that time what was going, in the church, and Paul VI, my goodness, who was already in the doldrums, an absolute disaster. But even he studies the document, the conclusions, and he felt that he had no choice but to issue an opinion by the Congregation of the Faith, saying that these conclusions were incorrect and in several cases clearly erroneous. The word erroneous, the word error in the Catholic Church means heresy, contrary to the faith. Error. Okay? They were actually saying, the Congregation of the Faith were actually saying that this was heretical. There is a paragraph at the end that ends saying that assembly had tried to, I quote, had tried to equate the sacred with the profane. And this comes from Paul VI in the Vatican. And then there were two priests, young priests at the time, who were already going about sort of behaving like film stars, who were outraged, can you believe, and at this reply from the Vatican. And they wrote a letter to the Vatican demanding that they should retract from that condemnation. My goodness, how dare you? Now, I'm following this from a lecture given. I'll put the name on the description box below. Okay, but this person is. This is where I got this example from. He's talking to an audience, and he says, "You want to know who these two young priests, film stars, kind of were?" And you hear the audience saying, yes, yes. And he said, well, I don't know whether to tell you. He's teasing them. Because, you would have never guessed. Who knows? You might have heard and listened to them. Perhaps you have even kissed their hands at some point, huh? And he gave the names, and although I know that you don't care and whatever, but you can look them up, and Rocco Varela and Ricardo Blázquez, and you hear the audience saying, "Oh!" Very well known. I believe they're still alive. They became bishops, archbishops, cardinals, with a sort of a sense of an aura of sainthood. If you look at I won't bother you with this anymore, because if you look at what they have done, the books that they have written, you can see who their masters are. But anyway, they my goodness, but they were both outraged at the Vatican saying that this was error. Of course, the Vatican, in reply to their letter, they just probably threw it away or something. But they, as I said, they became bishops, archbishops, cardinals, nuncios, the highest possible, One Monsignor Cantero said, "The situation of the church in Spain is very dire. This new clericalism is mixed with heretical doctrines. Those who try to make us believe that the division of the church occurs because of the Franco regime are deceiving us. The motives are different and deeper. The blame lies on those who, while calling themselves theologians, despise and reject the teachings of the church. In Spain, what we are experiencing is an authentic crisis of the faith. That is the problem. Where this is already 70s. The Trinity is attacked, the Eucharist is attacked, the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the sacrament of penance. Lo and behold, even the Virgin Mary. Well, we heard the Pope the other day saying something or other. Catholics going against the Virgin Mary. Now, I'm saying this because I know and you know that this does not come from the people. This is directed from above. That is why I'm calling it betrayal. The so-called liberation theology wreaks havoc. The joint assembly caused very great damage that has been accentuated by the rebellious attitude that some bishops have taken. This is Monsignor Cantero speaking. So we're coming back to the hierarchy. Authority, responsibility, duty, and obligation. When you are in charge of something, you are in charge of the whole... I'm getting upset here with the microphone. You are in charge of all that comes with that office. That office brings with it not just its privileges and allowances. And so now will come the moment of truth for Spain, and that is the Constitution in 1978, the new Constitution. And that is the point of no return. If it gets approved as it is written, it is over for the church in Spain, for Spain as a Catholic country. If it gets rejected, there might be a chance. And what does the church do? That church, the moderns. The majority say that we must vote in favor because they just think that this is an absolute marvel of a constitution. Others assent with their silence. And there are only, I will not read you the names, but only a few that deserve to be, stand up and applaud, but I will not read them out to you. But they can do little but just write down their disapproval. It says, let me find it here. And the Constitution that was approved is the Constitution, current Constitution today. They said, this Constitution is profoundly agnostic by real and not just nominal omission of any reference to God, being irreconcilable with it is irreconcilable with the moral duty of the society with its true religion. In other words, Spain for the first time stopped being a Catholic country with that constitution. Stop. Spain, for the first time, is not a Catholic country since the 1st century. They continue, any lack of reference to the supreme principles of natural and divine law meant that it is at the mercy of the alternating powers, without any active reference to that, natural and divine law. It is at the mercy of the alternating powers, this political party, that political party, this ideology, the other ideology. The moral orientation of laws and government actions. With the regime, the laws were based on the church moral and social doctrines. Okay, so they're saying the alternating powers, okay, and natural and divine law, which represent a safe conduit. No, sorry, I'm reading this wrong. So these alternating powers that will interpret it this way or that, or they may change the laws or whatever, represent a safe conduit for legalized attacks against the inalienable rights of a human being by, they say, equating the freedom to spread pure air with the freedom to spread contaminated air. Oh, you can have freedom, but a freedom, is it the same freedom to contaminate, to spread, let's say, to spread fresh air or to spread contaminated air? In other words, what are you going to do with that freedom? That is the words, the example that they used. Continue. The resulting freedom was not equal. You can't just stay on freedom. Resulting freedom was not equal for all, since, in truth, the freedom to breathe pure air was prevented by forcing people to breathe contaminated air. That's what they said. There were no guarantees with this constitution for freedom of education. There are no guarantees for freedom of education and equal opportunities by the fact that you're not truly guaranteeing to the parents the religious and moral education of their children. Because the educational orientation the fundamental Spanish uses is obviously the future, children and grandchildren. So this was left, that is their criticism, was left unduly left in the hands of the oligarchies, of political parties, and were still subjecting the management of educational centers to obstacles in favor of Marxist tactics. In short, if the harm that this it is the harm that this could do to Christian families, if this was passed, the harm that could be done to Christian families was incalculable. We're seeing this today. More. The Constitution does not protect the moral values of the family, opening the door for the indissoluble marriage by divine and natural right to be attacked by the plague of a divorce law. And they go on point by point about the Constitution. The Constitution was put to a referendum and they won. And the result was this sort of a satanic coven, a covenant, an assembly of witches, not very far from the Luciferian stance. What was approved was and is and continues to be manifestly anti-Catholic. Obviously, they were trying to bring the French Revolution here. The Church! And because it is anti-Catholic, it is anti-national, opposed to the laws of the will of God. It clearly and openly spits at heaven, breaks again the most important pillar upon which the country and the nation was based and was always based, which is the Catholic faith, without which irremediably falls and decays and degenerates. The approval of that constitution made a reality the fact that Spain stopped officially being Catholic, and because of that it ceased to be Spain as we see it today. It's always, very vague, altruistic, vague concepts. When you see a very vague and altruistic and beautiful concept, the brotherhood of man, the equality, this and that, okay, be careful. Because it is these vague words that that enchant you, because they're usually manipulating your decency as a human being who could be against equality. Okay, so they're going to manipulate that good sense that you have, that moral sense that you have, and what happens is that they will lead you, manipulating your decency, down that primrose path, and you follow because there is this beautiful, there is nothing but sweet smelling roses along the way. And when you realize it, you are there at the verge of a precipice, and guess what? You either jump or they procure the only means of salvation. The only way you can save yourself is if you get into this car with me. And most people opt for that, of course. That's natural. So what came after that? Okay, license, debauchery, disorder, chaos, lack of authority, corruption, crime, disunion, confrontation, dissolution, heresy, decadence, materialism, betrayal, treason. And I finish as I started. The truth makes you free, and truth has to be spoken out and not in whispers or vague sentimentalities. Whispers are used by those who want to deceive you. If you're speaking the truth, you speak it out loud. It's easier when you're in the dark, when no one can see you, when you are in this secret society or that. Of course, my goodness, anyone can win like that, yeah? But they can only win because we not stand firm. No, that is not true. The church was the pillar, the key piece, the cornerstone of betrayal to Spain, treason to God, treason to Spain, treason to Franco, treason to the fallen, to the martyrs, and to the faith from the first century. The people had held that faith. What else can we say? Those responsible, those who had the authority, therefore the responsibility, the duty and the obligation that comes with that authority. We see that they made a mistake. If indeed it was a mistake that they were making. I don't think so. I don't think those who do not speak up against what happened then or what's happening now are making a mistake. They're not that stupid. So let us hope that our Lord, who is just, has demanded an explanation of them, at least. And to those who fought, within their own limited strength, that God has rewarded them and has acknowledged that effort. Let me close. It's not a cliche. Let's keep hope. God brings out good from evil sometimes. He is almighty. He can do what he wills. He can do what he wants. My understanding is that, as I said, sometimes he might, but most of the time he wants us to contribute our little pebble. That he doesn't do it gratis. Free of charge, free of cost, free of sacrifice, meaning he wants a little something in return. He might do so if he wants to, of course, to those with special grace. But I think for the most part he wants us to at least try to do our own duty first, in whichever way we can. Our obligation. As St. Paul says, shortly before suffering martyrdom, I have kept the faith, and I have fought my fight. I didn't look it up, but I think it's something like that. I didn't look it up because I don't know where it is. because I'm Catholic, you see, because I don't, like Protestants know the verse and and so on, but I read the Bible I hear the Bible in church, I read it, but I read it not in terms of a scholar, like this, chapter this, verse this, and that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just read it as a whole thing, so I never remember exactly where it is or which verse. It doesn't make sense to me. It would make sense if I was studying theology, and that would be, a show of how I know where to find the material. But to me, doing that with the Bible, to me is the teachings of the religion. It doesn't make it's as let me explain. It's as if, for example, that one of my favorite authors is Dostoevsky, right? Well, I read a book by Dostoevsky. I do not bother to remember that he said this in page 107 or 72. It doesn't make sense. It would make sense if I was a scholar of Dostoevsky and I would say, well, in chapter 3, line 7, he said this. Fantastic. Nothing against it. But I'm not. I just read the book. All right. So that is why I know he said it. It's like when I hear the gospel, I never know whether it is in Luke or in Mark or to me, ignorant that I am, I just said, well, it's there in the gospel somewhere. I don't know where, wherever it is. So anyway, but I know he said this somewhere. Perhaps those of you who know more than I am can tell me. But I have kept the faith, and I have fought my fight, or something like that. What I mean to say is that we all have, each one of us, to fight this fight in different ways. You fight it in one way, I have to fight it another. But a fight it will be. What matters is that we shall be judged as to whether we have fought well or not well, or badly or not at all. Our own little pebble fight. Within our fight, within where God wants us to be. Here at this moment. That's the important thing. So, let us keep our spirits up. Let's not lose that. Let us not allow ourselves to be carried away by the sirens and their sweet songs. Let us be centered and hopefully do the right thing. Okay, I leave it there. Thank you for liking, subscribing, sharing. Please share it. And that's it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. And your comments. Bye-bye.